Hi, everybody. Welcome back to this week's lectures on the philosophy of ethics. Today, we'll be focusing on Kant's categorical imperative. So remember that Socrates has this belief that moral knowledge can be attained through reason, through thinking, and you don't have to use intuition and emotion to guide your behaviors. In fact, you probably shouldn't. You should think carefully about what you do and what's right and what's wrong and what you should value in life. Those truths, that knowledge, could actually be attained through your rational faculties. So when we took a look at this moral dilemma, right, the famous trolley problem, and in our version we talked about how imagine a train coming down a track headed towards 5 people tied to the track. Would you pull a lever that diverts the train away from the 5 but killing one person on the other track? Or would you not pull the lever, allowing that train to run over the 5? Your thought process, the way you think about how to determine the right or wrong action here, that's moral reasoning. And last lecture, we explored a form of moral reasoning referred to as consequentialism, right? This is where the right act is based upon the consequence of your action. The specific philosophy we looked at was utilitarianism, which says you should do that which brings about the most happiness, right? The consequence being the most happiness. However, there's another type of moral reasoning referred to as deontology, and this refers to your duty. It's not the consequence of your action, it's about following your principles. So the right act is that which follows or is according to your maxims, your duty, your principles. Okay, so what does this look like? One of the more famous forms of deontology comes from Immanuel Kant. It's referred to as his categorical imperative. But to understand where he's coming from and how he gets to believing in it, let's first understand he believes that when judging goodness, when determining right and wrong behaviors, what's really important is goodwill. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, first, he says, realize that consequences cannot explain why our actions are morally good or morally bad. Consequences, the results can't do that. So just imagine that, just imagine you are thinking of going to visit your mom, right? Now, if you are saying to yourself, man, I need some money. Like, I want to buy some sweaters, I want to buy a shirt. So I'm going to go visit mom because, mom's going to give me some money. Okay? So you go visit mom. Now, mom is super excited that you come over to visit because you never come over to visit, right? This is great for her. She says, fantastic. She came over to visit. Okay. Now, would you say your act was a good one? Would you say that you visiting your mom is praiseworthy because you brought about some happiness, right? You get some money from mom to buy your shirts, and mom is happy that you stopped by. Well, Kant says that's not really praiseworthy, right? Your action wasn't really a good act because you went there to manipulate your mom. You went there to get something from your mom. How could you call that a good thing, right? So for Kant, it's really the motives are important in order to determine whether the act was good. It's the motivation, it's the intention that's important, why you're doing something, not necessarily what the result is. So he says it is the will that determines if our actions are bad or good, not consequences. Moral praiseworthiness should be based on what we are trying to achieve rather than what we achieve. So if you tell yourself, okay, I'm going to drive 3 hours to visit mom on Tuesday because it'll make her day. She's going to love it for me to stop by, right? Drive my 3 hours to stop by. Um, I can't wait to tell her. So you call mom, hey, mom, coming over. I can't wait to see you. But then you drive and then you can't make it, right? You have a flat tire or you're called back into work. Um, Something happens where you actually aren't able to make it to mom. Well, you're disappointed, your mom's disappointed. So, in terms of utility, not so good, right? In terms of happiness, not so good. Yet, wouldn't you say that your action there was praiseworthy? Wouldn't you say your attempt to go see mom was more morally good than you actually seeing mom because you want to manipulate her to give you some money? So, Kant, oops, for Kant, your actions are much more praiseworthy because of the intention of them, right? Because of your goodwill. But here's his argument for this, for goodwill, right? As being a key factor in determining what's moral. P1, it's possible to have evil intentions that lead to positive consequences. P2, it's possible to have good intentions that lead to bad consequences. P3, it turns out consequences are often outside of our control, that we can't really always determine what's eventually going to happen. And four, the only thing we actually can control is the reason why we do something. So, given that, shouldn't we be judging an action as being good or bad based upon the intention of it? Shouldn't we judge an action as being good or bad based upon our goodwill as opposed to trying to bring about certain consequences? So, Kant's going to add a third part to this by saying a goodwill is the result of humans acting autonomously through reason rather than impulse, right? Rather than just like some coercion from some outside force. What's really important is that you are using your will, you're exercising your reason to make a choice to do something. Because goodwill refers to you making a choice. Goodwill refers to you intending to do something, not being coerced, right? Not unconsciously doing something, right? Goodwill is about you consciously choosing to do something. So let's say you have a friend who's struggling with a move, right? They're trying to move to a new apartment and they're having a hard time. So you offer to help. Okay, I'll help you. I'll help you over the weekend. You wake up on Saturday and oh my gosh, you have this crazy headache. You have a couple of options, don't you? I mean, your headache, your body is saying to you, don't do it. Don't help out, right? Just stay in bed, just chill. Call your friend up saying, dude, I can't help. I'm sorry. Or your other option is you think it'll be good to help your friend, right? You're like, hey, it's a good thing. They could use my help. Maybe you think to yourself that it'd be nice because you wish other people would do the same for you, that they would, not succumb to a headache and help you out when you're in need, especially after they promised you to do it, right? So this option, you rationally choose to overcome your impulse, your desire to stay at home in bed and sleep, to go help your friend. Which should be more praiseworthy? Which would deserve more kudos, right? Option one or option two? Kant says, isn't it obvious option two? Because you're exerting your free will to do something like follow through with your word. That seems to be the more praiseworthy action than you just staying in bed, especially after you promise them, right? Okay. So when we think about moral reasoning, what is it that guides our behavior? Kant's philosophy, right, is based upon a categorical imperative. Now that he's established that's not about the consequences, it's about the principle, right? It's about acting out of some sort of goodwill, good intention. What does that mean? What's a good intention? It's acting out of a moral principle, a moral rule. Okay, this he refers to as a categorical imperative. So why? What's those terms mean? Well, he says moral claims are imperatives. They're things you should do, right? That's what an imperative refers to. It's something you should do. Well, there are two types, he says. One is a hypothetical imperative. If I want X, then I ought to do Y. For example, if I want to pass my exam, I ought to attend lecture, right? It's hypothetical because there's no guarantee of what's going to be the outcome. There's no guarantee of the consequences. So it's a hypothetical imperative. He says that doesn't really have anything to do with morality for all the reasons we talked about earlier with consequences. Morality is really about categorical imperatives. They're things you should do just because. They're things you should do because it's just the right thing to do. I ought not to murder people. Not because they will hypothetically get me to a certain consequence, but because it's just the right thing to do. Categorically, it's what you should do. Right? So this is more reason-based, more rational, because you think, you reason, and then you come to a conclusion of what this principle or what this duty should be. So how do you think through this? What's the reason? What's the rationale? Kant says the rationale should be to do the following. Act only according to the maximum or the principle, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Okay, so how do we digest this? How do we simplify this? Well, whatever principle you use, right? Whenever you say, I should not murder somebody, you that would be okay if you're fine with that being a universal law for everybody. Are you okay if everybody followed the law that you shouldn't murder people? If you say, yeah, I am okay with that becoming universal law, then we call that a universal law, right? So another way of thinking about this is, you act in a way where you're not an exception, right? Where it's not just something that's good for you, but you wouldn't be cool with everybody else doing it. That wouldn't be a universal law. Another way of thinking about it is you act in a way so that anytime you acted, you'd be okay if all of a sudden, boom, everybody acted the same way. That's a universal law, right? Another way of thinking about this, Kant believes that you can say the same thing by saying act in a way such that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or any other person, as always uh, at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. So you never treat somebody as just a thing. You never denigrate somebody. You treat somebody as if they have infinite worth, infinite value, right? So that no matter what the consequences, you never treat them as a way to get to something. We take a look again at the Robin Hood situation, stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Is that a morally acceptable act according to the categorical imperative? Well, if you take a look at the universal law, probably not, right? Because if we make it a universal law to be able to steal from the rich to give to the poor, then just about everybody can be stolen from all the time. Because there's always somebody worse off for your money to go to. So we just all be robbing each other constantly. All right, that doesn't make any sense, says Kant. And no, if you take a look at the other way of interpreting this universal law, right, the categorical imperative, because you're treating people as as a means to an end, right? You're not valuing this person. You're just stealing from them, and that gives you the ability to give to other people. The person you stole from, you're not even treating them as somebody of value, somebody of worth. You just treat them as a means to accomplish something. So hopefully you see that the universal law and end in itself ways of defining the categorical imperative, why Kant believes are saying the same thing. Well, what are some advantages of this philosophy? One is now we have a rational foundation for moral absolutes. Now we can say, no, slavery is wrong, or murdering innocent people is wrong. because we can use Kant's categorical imperative to provide the rationale that we wouldn't want that to be a universal law that allows murder. We don't want a universal law that says, slavery is okay, right? We'd be okay if we had a law that says slavery is abolished. We were okay. We'd be okay if we said, everybody should live in a way where we don't murder people. Two, there's now a way to get clear foundational duties to help guide all of our actions. So we can start to develop our principles, and then when we come to certain circumstances that require decisions, we have a principle already there to be used and applied to the situation, right? Three, this implies that all human beings infinitely are worthy, that they have infinite worth, which is not something you will find necessarily in utilitarianism, right? Where the means justify the ends, no matter what. No matter what the ends are, each human being is of infinite value. Four, this seems to be compatible with our intuitions about human rights, right? If we have a belief that we should not have slavery, that everybody should be treated equally, that women should be given the same rights as men, um, uh, any sort of idea of human rights can be justified through Kant's categorical imperative, while it may not be so with utilitarianism, because there might be a way to say that you should treat these people differently than us because that brings about the most happiness. You should treat them not fair because then they'll bring up more happiness for the rest of us. With Kant's categorical imperative, that won't fly, right? So you might be able to see how certain groups might find Kant's categorical imperative appealing. Any group that has a belief in human rights might find this appealing. So then, when we take a look at right or wrong, well, right or wrong is dependent upon you following your principles. What do we value in this case? Well, human beings have infinite value, never to be treated as means to an end, where we are okay doing something as long as we're okay with everybody following the same rule, right? Because we have respect for all people. What's our obligation? Well, we're obligated to follow Kant's categorical imperative. We're obligated to do that which we'd be okay would become a universal law for all people, right? So what about problems? What are some objections some people might have to Kant? Well, is it really easy to determine what universal law we should follow at times? Because there might be more than one that we could follow at a given circumstance, right? So let's imagine our scenario with the train again, or the trolley, and somebody is next to you who you could push over to stop the train from running over people on the tracks. Do you push that person over? Well, can't you say there's a couple of duties there? I mean, there's the duty not to murder somebody, but isn't there also like the duty to save five people? Aren't there competing duties? How do you know which one is the better one? How do you know which one you should follow? What do you think Kant would say about this scenario? Well, let's apply the categorical imperative, okay? Take a look at these duties. Which one would you be okay with if it were to become a universal law? You might say the duty not to murder, I'd be okay with. But what about the duty to save five people? Would you be okay if that became a universal law? That everybody would always have to save five people? Well, probably not, right? Because then your entire life would just be about you running around trying to save five people. So the duty not to murder would actually be what the categorical imperative would tell you would be a principle to follow, right? Well, how about if we take a look at the other way of looking at the categorical imperative? What if you look at the ends in itself? So if we take a look at not murdering, all right, so we don't push the person, Well, we're not treating anybody as a means to an end in that case. But if we do push the person over, saving the 5 people on the track, then we're using that person as a means to an end. So within the ends in itself way of looking at the categorical imperative, we see too that you should not push the man over. Can you see then what would happen with the original train response for Kant? Well, with the categorical imperative, you should not pull the lever, right? You should not pull the lever because you're treating that single person on the track as an end, or I'm sorry, as a means to an end. You're treating them as a way to save the 5. Other problems for Kant? Well, let's say there is a hitman that comes to your house, right? And he's looking for your friend who just came over to visit. Your friend saw that the hitman's at the front door, so he runs to the kitchen to hide. Okay, so the hitman knocks on the door. Hey, I'm looking for Joey. What do you do? What do you say? Do you lie and say Joey's not here because you don't want Joey to die? Or do you say Joey's in the back in the kitchen? If you're following categorical imperative, it might be best to not lie, right? Because if you tell the lie, what are you doing? You're basing your action off the consequence. You're basing your action off not wanting your friend to get killed. Well, that's not Kant's categorical imperative. The principle of not lying would seem to fit Kant's categorical imperative. So that means when they knock on your door, you should say, Joey's in the kitchen, right? The way Kant sees this is that if you actually lie and you say, Joe is not here, and then your friend eventually gets murdered, you're to blame either way, right? Because you lied, and then the consequence ended up with your friend being murdered, right? So you say, my friend's not here, and your friend's actually running back to his car around, and then the hitman notices and then shoots your friend. Right? You're wrong in both counts. You're wrong because you said a lie, which goes against your principle, and you're wrong because the consequences didn't end up the way you'd wanted. But let's say you told the truth. If you tell the truth and said, oh, my friend's in the kitchen, well, then you're not to blame either way, right? Because you have no control over the consequences, and you're following your principle. So you'd be justified in not lying. What do you think about that? Or what do you think about the issue with the scenario we looked at with utilitarianism? If you are a person that is trying to hide a Jewish family in Nazi Germany, let's say in your basement, and the Nazis come knocking your door saying, hey, are you hiding any Jews? According to Kant, you should tell the truth and say yes, because that is a universal law to not lie. Does that sit well with you? Kant's philosophy to some people just seems way too strict to have these universal laws, these duties that you follow no matter what. It seems like there should be some room to apply your sense of ethics differently depending on the circumstances, right? Which is why some people gravitate towards utilitarianism. But as we saw last class, there are problems with that too. So, can you see how you'd apply both forms of moral reasoning to the film Minority Report? Can you see how you could use consequentialism and utilitarianism to support a certain point of view? Can you see how you could use Kant's categorical imperative and following a sense of duty support a different point of view? Right? The question now, though, is we've been under the assumption that you can use your sense of reason to come to a moral decision. You can use your sense of reason to determine moral knowledge, right? Ethical knowledge. But is that necessarily true? Is there a way to determine right action besides applying some sort of formula to it. In fact, is ethics really about right action? Or is there another way of looking at ethics? This is what we'll take a look at when we come back next class.